Sirens begin first, a rising wail cutting through the night air across Israeli cities, Tel Aviv, Haifa, Jerusalem. Phones vibrate with emergency alerts. Families rush toward stairwells and shelters. Above them, the sky flashes. Moments later, the first interceptors launch. Thin streaks of light rise from the ground, climbing fast into the darkness. Then, sudden bursts of white fire high overhead, where incoming missiles are destroyed before they reach the ground. In underground command centers, officers stare at radar screens. Each green dot represents another incoming projectile. Some will be intercepted, some may not. Across the region, the confrontation is already unfolding. Missiles are being launched, air defenses are firing, and somewhere, military planners are already calculating the next move. To many watching the headlines, nights like this feel like sudden crises, explosions of violence that appear out of nowhere. But in reality, these moments are rarely sudden. They are the latest turn in a long and dangerous cycle. For decades, one strategic rivalry has shaped the security calculations of the entire Middle East. A shadow conflict between Israel and Iran. A conflict fought through sabotage, missile strikes, covert operations, and proxy forces stretching across the region. Each round promises to weaken the other side. Each round promises deterrence. And yet, when the smoke clears, the confrontation never truly ends. Because behind every missile launched tonight lies a much larger question. Not just whether Israel can strike Iran's capabilities, but whether those strikes can actually solve the problem at all. For Israel, Iran is not simply another rival in the region. It is widely viewed as the single most consequential long-term threat to the country's security. For decades, Israeli leaders across the political spectrum, left, center, and right, have returned to the same conclusion. Iran's ambitions, particularly its nuclear program and expanding missile capabilities, represent a challenge that could fundamentally reshape the balance of power in the Middle East. This belief has shaped Israeli strategy for years. Inside Israeli security circles, the concern is not limited to nuclear weapons alone. It is the broader architecture Iran has been building across the region, a network of alliances and armed groups stretching from Lebanon to Syria, from Iraq to Yemen. Hezbollah in Lebanon, militias in Syria. Partners across the wider Middle East, capable of launching rockets, drones, and missiles toward Israeli territory. From Israel's perspective, these forces form what many analysts describe as a ring of pressure, a strategic environment in which Iran can threaten Israel not only directly, but through multiple fronts at once. But at the center of this concern lies the nuclear question. If Iran were ever to obtain a nuclear weapon, Israeli leaders argue, it could dramatically alter the region's deterrence balance. An adversary already capable of launching thousands of missiles could suddenly operate under the protection of a nuclear umbrella. For Israeli policymakers, that possibility is not treated as a distant hypothetical. It is viewed as a strategic red line. And this perception has produced something rare in Israeli politics. Consensus, governments change, coalitions rise and fall, prime ministers come and go. But the fundamental assessment of Iran as a central national security threat has remained remarkably consistent. Yet, when political agreement becomes this broad, something else often happens. Debate becomes narrower, and the range of possible strategies begins to shrink. Faced with what it sees as a growing strategic threat, Israel has developed a clear guiding principle over the past 2 decades. If a danger cannot be eliminated through diplomacy, it must be slowed through pressure. That pressure takes many forms. Covert. Intelligence operations, cyber attacks, targeted strikes on military infrastructure, and, when necessary, direct military action designed to damage the systems supporting Iran's nuclear and missile programs. The goal of these actions is not always immediate destruction. Often, it is delay. Every damaged facility, every disrupted supply chain, every destroyed piece of equipment, all of it buys time. Time that Israeli leaders believe is critical in preventing Iran from reaching a point where its nuclear program becomes unstoppable. Few Israeli leaders have articulated this approach more clearly than Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. For years, he has argued that sustained pressure, especially if supported by the United States, could fundamentally alter Iran's strategic trajectory. In this view, repeated military setbacks would eventually force Tehran to reconsider the costs of continuing its nuclear ambitions. The logic is straightforward. If the price becomes high enough, eventually the strategy must change. But that assumption depends on something difficult to measure: whether Iran's leadership actually sees these setbacks the same way Israel does. Because if the pressure fails to change Iran's long-term calculations, then every strike, every sabotage operation, every confrontation may be achieving something much more limited. Not solving the problem, only delaying the next chapter of it. For many years, this strategy has delivered real results. Facilities have been damaged, equipment has been destroyed, critical components of Iran's nuclear program have been delayed. Israeli intelligence operations have disrupted supply networks. Cyber attacks have sabotaged sensitive systems. Airstrikes have targeted military infrastructure tied to Iran's regional activities. Each operation has imposed real costs, and in the short term, those costs matter. Every delay can slow technical progress. Every disruption can complicate planning. Every destroyed facility can set back years of work. But over time, a difficult pattern has also emerged, because after each setback, Iran rebuilds. Damaged facilities are repaired, new components are manufactured, scientists continue their work, and gradually the programs begin moving forward again. In other words, the damage is real, but the strategic outcome remains uncertain. This raises a deeper question, one that Israeli policymakers rarely discuss publicly, but increasingly confront behind closed doors. Can military force permanently resolve a challenge rooted in ideology, deterrence logic, and regime survival? Or is it simply managing the pace of a competition that cannot easily be stopped? For decades, Iran's leadership has treated its nuclear and missile programs as central pillars of national security. External pressure has not eliminated that belief. In some cases, it may even reinforce it, which means the real issue is no longer whether Israel can impose costs. It clearly can. The real question is whether those costs are capable of changing Iran's long-term strategy, or whether each confrontation simply resets the clock until the next one begins. In purely military terms, many of Israel's operations against Iranian targets have been remarkably effective. Over the years, intelligence services have penetrated deeply into Iranian networks. Sensitive facilities have been sabotaged, critical equipment has been destroyed, key figures connected to Iran's nuclear program have been targeted, and at various moments, these actions have produced dramatic results. Entire sections of nuclear infrastructure have been taken offline. Missile production sites have been damaged. Secret facilities have been exposed to the world. From an operational perspective, these are significant achievements. They demonstrate the reach of Israeli intelligence and the precision of its military capabilities. But tactical success does not always translate into strategic change. Because even after major setbacks, Iran's long-term trajectory has remained largely intact. The nuclear program continues to advance, missile development continues, and the regional network of Iranian partners, from Lebanon to Yemen, remains active. This is not because the damage is insignificant. In many cases, it has been severe. But the Iranian leadership has repeatedly shown a willingness to absorb those costs. For Tehran, the nuclear and missile programs are not optional projects. They are seen as essential elements of national deterrence and regime security. And when a government believes that its survival depends on a particular capability, setbacks alone rarely cause it to abandon the effort. Instead, the program adapts. Facilities are rebuilt, methods are adjusted, security measures are tightened, and over time, the work continues, which means that every successful operation raises a difficult question. If the strikes are tactically successful, why does the strategic problem keep coming back? To understand why the cycle continues, it is necessary to look at the conflict from the other side. Because inside Tehran, the nuclear and missile programs are not viewed the same way they are in Jerusalem or Washington. For Iran's leadership, these capabilities are not simply tools of influence, They are tools of survival. Since the Islamic Revolution of 1979, the Iranian regime has operated in what it sees as a hostile strategic environment, surrounded by American military bases, facing decades of sanctions, and confronting regional rivals that openly question the legitimacy of the regime itself. In that environment, Iran's military doctrine has evolved around one central principle: deterrence. Iran's leaders frequently describe their strategy as defensive, designed not to conquer territory, but to prevent external powers from threatening the state. Missiles, drones, proxy forces, and potentially nuclear capabilities all serve the same purpose. They raise the cost of attacking Iran. From this perspective, every new capability strengthens the regime's ability to survive, and every foreign strike reinforces the belief that stronger deterrence is necessary. This logic helps explain why military pressure does not always produce the intended effect. Instead of persuading Iran to abandon its programs, attacks can sometimes push the leadership in the opposite direction. If the regime believes it is under constant threat, then giving up its deterrent capabilities would be seen not as compromise, but as vulnerability. Iranian officials have said openly that physical destruction alone cannot stop the program, because the most important component is not the buildings or the machines, it is the knowledge. As one Iranian leader put it after earlier strikes on nuclear facilities, the destruction of buildings does not eliminate the program because knowledge resides in the minds of our scientists, which means that even after facilities are destroyed, the strategic motivation remains, and as long as that motivation exists, the program has a way of coming back. When both sides believe their actions are defensive, escalation can become extremely difficult to control. This is the dilemma at the center of the Israel-Iran rivalry. Israel views Iran's nuclear and missile programs as an existential or near-existential threat. Iran views Israeli strikes, covert operations, and international pressure as proof that it must strengthen its deterrence. Each side believes it is reacting to the other. And with every round of confrontation, the logic becomes more entrenched. When Israel strikes Iranian facilities, the goal is to impose costs and delay progress. But those strikes rarely happen in isolation. Iran responds, sometimes directly through missile launches or drone attacks, other times indirectly through regional partners capable of opening new fronts: Hezbollah in Lebanon, militia groups in Syria and Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen. Each response sends a signal. Iran retains the ability to retaliate. Israel then prepares for the next round. Air defenses are strengthened. New intelligence operations are launched. Additional targets are identified. And when another opportunity emerges to weaken Iran's capabilities, another strike may follow. Over time, the pattern becomes familiar. Strike, retaliation, damage on both sides, rebuilding, then preparation for the next confrontation. What begins as a strategy of deterrence gradually turns into something else, a recurring cycle of escalation, one in which neither side fully backs down, but neither side fully resolves the conflict either. In this environment, every confrontation risks becoming less about forcing a decisive change and more about managing the damage. The question is no longer whether Israel can impose costs on Iran. It clearly can. The deeper question is whether those costs accumulate into meaningful strategic change, or whether each round simply resets the confrontation, leaving both sides to prepare for the next one. The limits of this cycle became particularly visible during one of the most recent confrontations between Israel and Iran. For nearly 2 weeks, the conflict escalated rapidly. What began with a sudden Israeli operation quickly expanded into a broader exchange of strikes, retaliation, and counter-retaliation across the region. In its opening phase, Israel achieved what many analysts described as a strong operational start. Precision strikes targeted Iranian military infrastructure. Facilities linked to missile production and military coordination were hit. For a moment, the balance of initiative appeared to favor Israel. In modern warfare, surprise can be decisive, and in those early hours, Israeli forces demonstrated the speed and reach that have become central to their military doctrine. But as the confrontation continued, another reality began to emerge. Despite the initial shock of the strikes, Iran retained the ability to respond. Missiles continued to be launched toward Israeli territory. Air defense systems intercepted many of them, but not all. Sirens sounded across Israeli cities as incoming projectiles forced civilians into shelters, and the exchanges continued, day after day. Even with a successful opening operation, Israel had not eliminated Iran's ability to retaliate. This was not a failure of Israeli military capability. Rather, it reflected a deeper structural problem within the confrontation itself. Iran's strategy has long assumed that it must be able to absorb significant damage while continuing to strike back. If the country can survive the first blow and still respond with force, then it maintains its deterrent. And during the confrontation, that logic appeared to hold. Iran continued, launching missiles even after suffering significant damage from the opening Israeli strikes. The result was a familiar pattern. Both sides demonstrated their capabilities. Both sides absorbed losses. But neither side forced the other to fundamentally change course, which means that even after days of intense confrontation, the strategic balance looked remarkably similar to what it had been before the fighting began. The cycle had not been broken. It had simply reached its latest chapter. Until this point, the confrontation between Israel and Iran might appear to be a bilateral rivalry. Two regional powers locked in a long-running strategic struggle. But in reality, the stakes extend far beyond the two countries directly involved. Because any major escalation between Israel and Iran would almost certainly draw in a third actor: the United States. For decades, Washington has been Israel's most important strategic partner. American military support, intelligence, cooperation, and diplomatic backing form a central pillar of Israel's security architecture. At the same time, the United States has its own complex relationship with Iran, a relationship shaped by decades of hostility, sanctions, nuclear negotiations, and periodic crises across the Middle East. This means that when tensions between Israel and Iran rise, Washington is rarely a distant observer. It becomes part of the strategic equation. If a confrontation were to expand into a larger conflict, the United States could quickly find itself facing difficult choices: whether to support Israeli military operations, whether to protect American forces stationed across the region, and whether to respond if Iranian partners begin attacking American interests. The risks of escalation therefore extend far beyond the immediate battlefield. Regional war could pull in multiple actors simultaneously: Hezbollah in Lebanon, militia groups in Iraq and Syria, Houthi forces capable of PvP, targeting shipping lanes and energy infrastructure. In such a scenario, a confrontation that begins as a series of strikes between Israel and Iran could rapidly expand into a much wider regional crisis. And once conflicts reach that scale, controlling the outcome becomes far more difficult, which is why the strategic dilemma surrounding Iran is not only an Israeli problem. It is increasingly a global one. At the center of this strategic dilemma lies a fundamental military reality. Air power can destroy infrastructure, but it cannot destroy knowledge. Modern air forces are capable of extraordinary precision. They can identify facilities, track movements, and strike targets hundreds or even thousands of kilometers away. Runways can be cratered, factories can be reduced to rubble, underground sites can be damaged by specialized weapons designed to penetrate hardened structures. In the short term, these strikes can be extremely effective. They can disrupt production. They can delay technical progress. They can force an adversary to divert enormous resources into rebuilding what has been destroyed. But nuclear programs are not defined only by their physical infrastructure. They are also defined by the scientists, engineers, and technical expertise behind them. And that expertise cannot be erased by a bomb. Even if laboratories are destroyed and equipment is lost, the knowledge that produced those capabilities remains. Researchers can relocate, facilities can be rebuilt, and over time, the work can begin again. This is the central strategic challenge facing any military campaign against a nuclear program. Airstrikes can delay development, sometimes for years, but delay is not the same as elimination. And in the case of Iran, rebuilding has repeatedly proven possible, which means that policymakers face a difficult question. Are they prepared for a future in which military action becomes a recurring tool, used again and again to slow progress, but never fully able to end it? Taken together, these realities create a dilemma that is difficult to escape. On one hand, doing nothing carries obvious risks. If Iran continues advancing its nuclear and missile capabilities without resistance, the balance of power in the region could shift in ways Israeli leaders consider unacceptable. From that perspective, action is necessary. Military strikes, covert operations, and sabotage slow progress and demonstrate that Iran's advances will carry consequences. But on the other hand, these actions rarely produce a permanent solution. Iran adapts, facilities are rebuilt, security measures improve, and the programs move forward again. Over time, what emerges is not a decisive confrontation, but a pattern, a recurring cycle in which military force becomes a tool of management rather than resolution. Each strike buys time, but time eventually runs out. And when it does, another confrontation becomes likely. This is the strategic dilemma facing policymakers. If military pressure is abandoned, Iran's capabilities may expand more rapidly. But if military pressure continues indefinitely, the confrontation itself may become permanent. In effect, the strategy risks locking both sides into a conflict without a clear end state, one where each round imposes costs, yet neither side achieves a decisive strategic outcome, which raises the question at the heart of this entire debate, not whether Israel can delay Iran's progress, but whether delay alone can ever truly resolve the problem. Inside Israel, discussions about Iran rarely begin with the question of whether the threat is real. That point is largely taken for granted. Across much of the Israeli political system, Iran's nuclear ambitions and expanding missile capabilities are viewed as dangers that cannot be ignored. And because the threat is often framed in near-existential terms, the range of acceptable policy responses becomes narrower. When a challenge is described as potentially threatening the survival of the state, caution tends to give way to urgency. Under those conditions, strategies based on pressure, deterrence, and preemptive action become politically easier to justify. Alternative approaches become harder to sustain in public debate. This dynamic has produced an unusual level of agreement across Israel's political spectrum. Parties that disagree on many domestic issues, economics, social policy, relations with the Palestinians, often converge when the discussion turns to Iran. The basic premise remains the same. Iran's capabilities must be contained, delayed, or weakened before they reach a point that Israel considers intolerable. But consensus can carry its own risks. When most leaders share the same strategic assumptions, fewer voices remain to question whether those assumptions still hold. In Israel, the broad political agreement surrounding the Iranian threat has limited, sustained public debate about whether repeated military campaigns can produce lasting outcomes. This does not mean Israeli concerns are exaggerated or misplaced. The fear of a nuclear-armed adversary in the region is deeply serious, but it does mean that certain questions receive less attention than others. Questions about whether military pressure alone can fundamentally change Iran's long-term trajectory, or whether a more diversified strategy, combining deterrence, diplomacy, and regional balancing, might eventually prove more sustainable. Even if the strategic debate were to broaden inside Israel, a major shift in policy would still be difficult to imagine. Because the focus on Iran is no longer tied to a single political leader or a particular government. It has become embedded in Israel's strategic culture. Over the past 2 decades, confronting the Iranian threat has evolved into a central organizing principle of Israeli national security policy. It shapes military planning. It influences defense spending. And it aligns closely with a doctrine that has grown stronger in Israel since the shock of October 7, 2023. A doctrine that prioritizes early action against emerging threats, prevent surprises, minimize risk, and whenever possible confront dangers before they fully materialize. Within that framework, Iran occupies a unique position. It represents both a long-term strategic challenge and a unifying political issue. Few Israeli leaders are willing to appear less vigilant on the Iranian threat than their rivals. As a result, elections rarely produce major changes in this area of policy. Different governments may adjust tactics, they may pursue different diplomatic approaches or emphasize different alliances. But the underlying strategic focus tends to remain constant, because as long as Iran continues advancing its nuclear and missile capabilities, Israeli leaders are likely to evaluate the threat not by what Iran says, but by what it is capable of doing. In the end, the confrontation between Israel and Iran is not defined by a single battle, a single strike, or a single moment of escalation. It is defined by persistence. Israel seeks to slow a threat it believes could one day become intolerable. Iran seeks to build the capabilities it believes are necessary to survive in a hostile environment. Both sides see their actions as defensive. Both believe the stakes are too high to step back. And so the cycle continues. Strikes, retaliation, rebuilding, again and again. Military force can buy time, it can delay dangerous capabilities and impose real costs. But time alone does not resolve strategic rivalries, which leaves one final question hanging over every future confrontation. If each crisis only postpones the next one, how, if ever, does the cycle truly end?